It's The Real News. I'm Ben Norton. This is part 2 of my interview with Ali Ornek. Ali Ornek is a Turkish journalist of Kurdish origin who previously worked for the leading Turkish newspaper Hürriyet Daily. He has extensively reported on the war in Syria, and in part 1 of this interview we discussed the Turkish invasion of northern Syria and Ankara's takeover of Kurdish majority cities. In this part we'll be discussing the very complex U.S. relationship with the Kurdish forces, with the YPG, the People's Protection Units. The U.S. has allied on and off with the YPG and with Kurdish political forces in the region in general. The U.S. has a long history of betraying many of these forces as well. So Ali Ornek and I will be discussing what has been going on with the YPG in northern Syria and what he thinks will happen in the future. I wanted to talk about the U.S. role in this. And in fact, you just mentioned something that's very interesting. A prominent Washington Post columnist recently published an article arguing against Trump's claim that Trump wants to withdraw the 2,000 U.S. military forces in Syria. It's unlikely that will happen, but a Washington Post columnist argued that the U.S. should stay, and one of the reasons he gave is because the U.S. controls many of the oil-rich regions in northern Syria. And he just openly spelled this out. He said, Trump, you should stay to seize this oil. And what's funny is the Washington Post column cited Israeli intelligence officials, members of neoconservative think tanks here in Washington, D.C., and even members of the Syrian opposition. So that's clearly something on the U.S. mind. But I'm also interested in your thoughts on, like you said, the YPG's relationship to the United States. Initially, the YPG allied, or maybe allied is the wrong word, but accepted support from the U.S. in order to fight ISIS. ISIS at this point has largely been militarily defeated, and there are still at least 10 U.S. military bases in northern Syria. We saw that the YPG, or at least elements of it, rebranded to an extent and allied with other Arab forces and forces from other ethnic groups to create the Syrian Democratic Forces, the SDF, which control parts of northern Syria. However, so there's no question that the YPG/SDF has closely allied with the U.S. in some of these battles. However, we also saw in Afrin that the YPG asked the government in Damascus for assistance and asked the Syrian army, and the Syrian government did send National Democratic Forces, so Syrian government allied forces, to Afrin to fight Turkey in alliance with the YPG. So do you think that it's fair to say that the YPG has thrown all of its cards in with the U.S., or is it trying to play this kind of neutral role and it's trying to maintain alliances not just with the U.S. but also with Syria and Russia?
The official explanation of YPG is that they are fighting ISIS, an arch enemy, and in order to defeat it, they ask U.S. Military support. But this is actually, I don't think that this is true. What Trump is currently carrying out in Syria as a plan, actually, this is not his plan. This is Obama's plan. When Obama refused to bomb Syria directly, the direct intervention in 2013, the U.S. government carried out a different plan. It's called defeating and degrading ISIS, but actually it's occupying Syrian territory under the pretext of defeating ISIS. So what does this plan basically offers? It's to grab the Syrian most valuable resources. Syria now needs $100 billion for its reconstruction. Its cities are destroyed and its whole transportation and energy systems were collapsed. So what Syrian government is now looking for is the oil resources and the gas resources of eastern Syria to finance this reconstruction. But when United States ex-Secretary of State Tillerson said this very openly, he said we have a card now in Syria by capturing these oil fields. there is. I don't think that this is not crystal clear anymore. This is very. They openly said this. Both Tillerson and also Mattis said that what they are trying is to choke Syria economically for a regime change, and YPG was part of this plan and still is part of this plan. And when we are talking about U.S. plans that are not focusing on defeating ISIS, we can't say that the YPG and U.S. relation is basically some sort of necessary military cooperation or coordination or something else. This is not true. When we are looking in 2012, when YPG all of a sudden occurred in northern Syria, they claimed a territory which is called Rojava. They said this is the land of Kurds, which needs to be autonomous or independent. But now the areas that are under control of YPG isn't that Rojava. It's bigger than it. They have southern Deir ez-Zor, which has never been a historical Kurdish land, and also they have Raqqa, which has always been an Arab city, and they have many other things like Tel Rifat, these, and Manbij also. And Manbij was half Arab and half Kurd, so they are out of their actual plan, and I think the legitimate plan. They are now acting as a proxy force for United States on ground, and we saw this even in Afrin. You know, I closely followed the war in Afrin front. For the first month, Turkish armed forces couldn't advance deep into the Afrin region, and each time PKK or YPG carried out huge counterattacks. But right after Rex Tillerson visit to Ankara, something had changed, and Turkish armed forces advanced in Afrin very quickly and very rapidly, and saw no huge counterattacks. And also, the capture of the city center of Afrin was very weird. You know, it was an urban warfare, and we know in Syria, urban warfare is very hard and took many times and life. But in Afrin, we didn't see it. YPG forces all of a sudden withdrew from the city and went back to Manbij. This is, I think, there is some sort of diplomatic deal with this withdrawal. It's not normal.
Yeah, and then
right after, what I'm trying to say is that with the Rex Tillerson visit to Turkey, they think U.S.-Turkey relations is on stake, and I think United States advised YPG to withdraw its forces to Afrin, sacrifice it to protect their actual core territory in the east of Euphrates River.
The PKK during the Cold War was identified with Marxism-Leninism. You know, it was a kind of more traditional communist movement. After the collapse of the Soviet Union and the end of the Cold War, the PKK moved toward, and especially since the 2000s, moved toward this kind of anarchist-style democratic municipalism, democratic confederalism, you know, cited by figures like Murray Bookchin. You know, Öcalan is now imprisoned in life by Turkey. There are also reports that the CIA was involved in his ultimate imprisonment. So again, we see a history of the U.S. betraying this movement, even though it appears in some ways to be allied with it today. However, when the PKK was, you know, identified with the Marxist-Leninist tradition, it was fighting for an independent state, an independent Kurdistan. Today, the position of the PYD, the political wing of the YPG, is that it wants to create an autonomous region that is not independent of the Syrian state. So why do you think that this is going on in northern Syria, that everything you've been discussing is going on, when the YPG says that it doesn't actually seek to create an independent Kurdistan? What are the contradictions there? And is it a matter of different elements within the YPG leadership disagreeing over this political question? Are there elements in the YPG leadership who, who led the SDF, who are more closely allied with the U.S. and support an independent Kurdistan? And are there also competing tendencies within the YPG who do not support the U.S. and who do not support creating an independent state?
Yeah, actually, I think YPG is suffering of some sort of identity problem. Although Kurds in northern Syria and in Turkey are the same people of the same nation, but they changed sociologically and historically and economically also after being isolated from each other for over a century. That's why also YPG suffers an identity problem, because it tries to be a Syrian movement while its leadership are actually Turkish. So nobody needs to hide this relation. YPG is under the control of Kandil in northern Iraq. All the other tales that U.S. government or someone else saying like they are different organizations. No, they are not. But what PKK tries to do is they want to be ally of the United States in long term, not just for Syria. This is why Turkey perceived it as a very big threat. This is not even new phenomena. In 2003, when the United States invaded Iraq, PKK very radically changed its anti-US rhetoric and they called invasion of Iraq as some sort of democratic invasion, which is invasion and evil, but also necessary for Iraq to be a democratic country. They said this. So they start to seek a ground to be ally with the United States, but the United States has always refused PKK to be ally and as an ally. So things were changed when Obama carried out a new plan. It's called, as I said, defeating and degrading ISIS. They thought YPG could be a very proxy force for this plan. So things changed, and when United States policy for regime change collapsed, they changed their plans and found PKK as a proxy force for this plan. And that this is what I'm trying to say is why PKK, if the only thing for PKK, the important thing for PKK is having an autonomous state, I think they can guarantee it long ago. I don't think that Russia would have strongly opposed some sort of autonomous region. Actually, based on what I have learned so far, is that actually Russia offered PKK some sort of autonomy, but autonomous region, but they refused, because being an ally with the United States is now more important for PKK. And hence, that's why I'm I said their defeat in Afrin was not a military defeat. It's actually a diplomatic defeat. They were asked by United States to withdraw their forces. So this is showing how much the PKK leadership pay importance to their relationship with the United States. And as I said, this is not a new phenomenon. This is for over 15 years, PKK was looking for this.
Well, we'll have to end this discussion here. This was part 2 of the Real News interview with Ali Ornek. Please join us for part 3. In part 3, we'll be discussing more of the complexities of the Kurdish question, if you will, inside Syria. We'll be discussing how the oppression of Kurds in Syria has been very different from the oppression of Kurds in Turkey, which has been extremely violent. And we'll be discussing more of what Ali thinks will happen in this very long 7-year war in Syria that doesn't seem to be ending anytime soon.